I can't stop thinking about Deltarune. Initially, I wasn't sure what to make of this story. Even now, I'm not entirely sure what direction the story will take, because, trust me, there are a ton of interesting thematic threads running through this game, and any of them could become more or less important. I felt that a lot of people playing this game found the surface-level themes about free will and called it a day. However, I think there is more to this game than a discussion of free will. I believe that Deltarune is partially about the relationship between the player and their on-screen avatar, and about the underlying horror of such a relationship. Ironically, I would like to start this discussion of Deltarune's story by talking about the ending, where Chris stumbles out of bed, rips his soul from his chest, and glances menacingly at the screen. After my first playthrough, I wasn't sure what to think of this ending. It was a shocking twist that raised a lot of questions, but I felt those questions would remain unanswered until the full game was released. Despite that, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I had missed something about this scene. After months of contemplation, I eventually asked myself a question. What was Chris's motivation for ripping out his soul? Perhaps I had asked myself this question before, but this time I finally realized that there was an answer, and in order to understand Chris's motivation, we need to discern the role that he plays in the narrative and his relationship with the player. Chris is a silent protagonist. He's less of a character in his own right, and more of a vessel for the player's agency. If the player wants to slaughter every enemy in their path, Chris will slaughter every enemy that stands in his way. If the player wants to spare every enemy, Chris will spare every enemy. If the player wants to walk in circles for hours, Chris will be walking in circles for hours. Essentially, Chris is the puppet which the player uses to exert their influence over the game. Chris's role is further enforced by the wonderfully surreal opening, where the game speaks directly to the player. Not Chris, or any other in-game character, but the person sitting in front of a screen playing a game called Deltarune. The player is prompted to create a vessel that represents themselves, and after lovingly crafting a suitable personification, it is discarded. It's important to note that this intro does a lot to emphasize the difference between the player and their on-screen representation. The game calls the player you, and the vessel it. Where most games stop at having you name your avatar, Deltarune goes one step further by having you name both the avatar and the creator, which clearly highlights that the avatar and player are not one and the same. As I was replaying the intro with this perspective in mind, I noticed a small detail that shook me to my core. When crafting the personality of your character, the game asks you 3 questions. What is its favorite food? Your favorite blood type? What color does it like most? On my first inspection, I completely missed the fact that 2 of these questions are about the vessel. What are its preferences? However, one of the questions is actually asking about the player. What is your favorite blood type? Deltarune's opening is very intentional with its use of you and it. So the fact that the game is asking for the player's favorite blood type is a bit unsettling. Of course, all the work you do creating that vessel was for naught, because the game discards the vessel of your own design, and declares that no one can choose who they are in this world. Your name is presumably Chris, but the screen fades to white before the text appears, so it is impossible to be certain. I have established that Chris and the player are not one and the same, but why is that horrific? Well, the game goes out of its way to establish that Chris is his own person. Chris has had a life of his own that the player has had no influence over. Chris used to go to church with his family, but he was never really interested in the sermon. He just wanted that sick fruit juice. And Chris would go with his family to the diner on Sundays, and after they stopped going as a family, he would still go with his brother, and he would draw shapes in the window with his breath. All of this is well and good. A lot of silent protagonists have histories, but something feels different about Chris. Firstly, Chris has a more fleshed out personality than most other silent protagonists. From the stuff I've already mentioned, you can tell that Chris is a kid that cares about his brother, but isn't super into the whole religion thing. Aside from this, there are also lines about Chris being the creepy kid next door. Environmental storytelling also gives us clues about Chris's nature. Looking at his room, you see that Azrael has won many honors and awards, but all Chris has on his side of the room is a rusty birdcage and some stains in the corner, further reinforcing that perception of creepiness expressed by other characters. This puts Chris into sharp contrast with most other silent protagonists, who typically try to remain as much of a blank slate as possible. Chris was already his own character, but you can tell that this previously established personality comes into conflict with how the player manipulates Chris. For all intents and purposes, Chris is a prisoner in his own body, and some stranger strings him along like a marionette. Just think about that for a second. Imagine if one day someone just took over your body, and you had to just sit in your skin and watch as they paraded you around as if they were you. This is probably infuriating for Chris because the player oftentimes makes choices that Chris would not make. When reaching the final area, most players will take the time to go around and talk to all the characters around town. However, when first talking to Noelle, she comments on how Chris usually isn't so talkative. When the player talks to Toriel, she might mention how Chris doesn't quite seem like himself, which is a pretty big smoking gun that the player is not acting like Chris normally would. Aside from the ending, there is one other instance where Chris fights against the player. When returning to the normal world, Chris's Dark World items just become a ball of junk. Chris clearly cherishes the memories that are contained within this junk ball. However, the player might not share those feelings and they can discard this ball of junk. However, Chris fights with every essence of his being. You really don't want to throw it away, the game says. Note that this sentence is a bit ambiguous. It could be referring to the player, but the player was the one who decided to drop the item, so it would seem a bit odd for the game to declare that actually you didn't want to discard this rubbish. Instead, I believe that the you in this statement is actually referring to Chris, who technically is you in this world, but not really. Of course, despite Chris's best efforts to fight against the player's agency, he is ultimately powerless to stop the player from discarding his cherished memories. If the player does discard the junk, Chris feels an extreme bitterness rise up within him. With this in mind, I want to take a few moments to compare Chris to the player Vessel in Undertale, because there are some interesting parallels to be drawn. Despite everything, it's still you. This line can be found by inspecting the mirror in New Home, and it is reflective of Undertale's approach to the player avatar. In Undertale, your protagonist is much more of a blank slate than Chris. Visually, the fallen human was designed so that their gender was ambiguous, allowing people from any gender to easily project themselves onto their protagonist. Toby also pulls a fast one on the player when they're creating their avatar in Undertale. When beginning the game, it prompts the player for a name, which the player assumes is for their avatar. This is false. However, the player wouldn't know it unless they took the time to do a pacifist run, in which it is revealed that you are actually playing Frisk. However, it doesn't really matter who you are, because in Undertale, your actions are more important than your identity. Undertale is more interested in showing you the consequences of your actions than showing some deep inner secret about Frisk. You don't even understand who you are for almost the entire game, but this just goes to show that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter that you are Frisk. The only thing that matters is how you choose to use your agency over this world. Despite everything, it's still you. In Deltarune, your choices don't matter as much as your identity. You don't get the luxury of choosing who you are in this world. No matter what you do, Chris will never be you in the same way that Frisk was you. Undertale was notorious for its meta themes that commented on how people play games. Those meta themes are a large part of Undertale's identity, which leads me to believe that Deltarune will have some sort of meta theme commenting on how people play games. In my opinion, these themes revolve around the relationship of the player and their avatar. Undertale was partially about how players use their agency in cruel ways in order to see the entirety of a game's content, even if that journey is painful and tedious. Deltarune is about how players impose their hopes and dreams onto their avatar without considering the implications of what that means. So, where does that leave us? So what if we're just using Chris as a vessel for our own actions and overriding Chris's desires? Well, I think this is all going to tie back into the themes of free will and agency found in the rest of the game. Deltarune Chapter 1 is constantly reminding the player that their choices don't matter. However, Chris is in an even worse spot than the player, because at least the player still has control over their avatar. Their choices might be superficial, but they can still be used as a tool for self-expression. Chris is the only person with absolutely no agency, save for the ending. Susie gets to decide that she doesn't want to listen to the player's command. Rousey listens to the player, but that is because he wants to fulfill the prophecy and aid the Lightners. Everyone has some say in their fate. Everyone except for Chris. That is why I think Chris rips out his soul at the end of the game. The player has stolen his agency, and he has decided that he doesn't want to be a puppet anymore. And with this sentiment fuming inside of him, he violently rips the player from his chest and locks them in a cage where they are powerless, just like he was. He wanted the player to feel just as trapped and isolated as he had been. And with that, the game ends. Except, there's one more thing we need to talk about. The credits song. When analyzed using the Chris-player relationship lens, I believe the ending song has a message directly from Chris to the player.
When the light is running low, and the shadows start to grow, and the places that you know seem like fantasy.
I believe these lines refer to the fact that Deltarune is a game. When the player plays Deltarune, they step into a world of pure fantasy.
There's a light inside your soul that's still shining in the cold, with the truth, the promise in our hearts. Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark.
The light inside your soul? That's Chris. He's still shining in the cold. Don't forget, he's with you in the dark.